It's a real honor to be here with Senator Hatch. Henry Waxman, of course, was a Democratic congressman from Los Angeles for 40 years. That is the presidencies of Ford, Carter, Reagan, H.W. Bush, Clinton, W. Bush, and Obama. So many I had to write them down. He was responsible for a number of major pieces of legislation, but the most relevant today, of course, is the Hatch-Waxman Act of 1984, which really led to the expansion of the generic drug industry. There was a chart earlier. In 1984, 20% of the prescriptions were for generics. Today, it's close to 90%. And I really do think that there's a consensus that the law which set up the current regime for managing and regulating generic drugs is largely responsible. I do want to mention that since Henry has left Congress, he's a lobbyist for a bunch of interests, including the 340B Coalition, which is seeking to preserve a program that provides discounts for certain drugs to hospitals and clinics, and also has been a lobbyist for a number of hospitals in California, just so if it's on the table. Now, I'm tempted to say, Congressman, that if Andrew Jackson had had more foresight, Hatch-Waxman would have passed in 1884. But since very few of us were involved in this industry at the time that Hatch-Waxman passed, I wonder if we could start with just explaining a little bit the question that came up in the earlier one. What were the political conditions that led to this piece of legislation and the coalition that led to the final product?
Thank you very much, and I want to congratulate the scholars who made excellent presentations and for Brookings to hold this forum. I feel like Marshall McLuhan in that Woody Allen movie. No, this isn't what I said. Just a little clarification on what I'm doing now. I left Congress, and I joined a firm called Waxman Strategies. I didn't establish it. It was already in place. My son had been working in the public relations area, and he said to me, "I will make you chairman of Waxman Strategies." And I said, "Well, that's pretty good. People could still call me Mr. Chairman." And I couldn't get that deal if I stayed on the Hill. I said, I will work with you in a public affairs group, but I want complete say over who I represent. So we don't represent just a bunch of hospitals. We represent the public hospitals in California. We also represent Planned Parenthood. We represent a group that's been trying to establish a diabetes program, a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week diabetes program. So we have a lot of clients, and we do have the 340B Hospital Association, and the National Community Health Centers. So we represent a lot of the groups that I fought for when I was in Congress. I was one of the authors of the 340B program. And so I am enjoying the fact that I can now continue my work in a different way. But in the 1980s, I was the author of a couple bills that were pertinent to high drug prices and the situation we have today, but we didn't think about it in that context. In the 1980s, the Pharmaceutical Manufacturers Association, PMA, it wasn't called PhRMA then, were concerned about the fact that a few years earlier, FDA had to not only establish the safety of a drug, but its efficacy, which meant more time was being spent for FDA approval. And they felt that they were being denied the full exploitation, the full reward for their patent because so much of the time was being spent at FDA. And they tried to get a restoration of the time lost at FDA for approval. There was a bill that they pursued solely for that purpose, and it got very far. It passed the Senate overwhelmingly. It passed the Judiciary Committee in the House, and they were so confident it would pass the House that it went on what's called a suspension calendar, which required two-thirds vote, but no amendments were allowed. Well, at that point, I teamed up with a young congressman who was on my committee named Al Gore. And we said, that really is going to dramatically increase the price of drugs. And we didn't think that was fair to do that just to increase the price of drugs. So we went to work to keep that bill from getting the 2/3 majority. It certainly had a majority. After it lost on the suspension calendar, the sponsors of the bill wanted to get a rule, and a rule would allow it to be brought up and passed by a majority vote. All these intricacies of the legislative process are well known now that we see the reconciliation process being used by the Republicans to repeal and replace Obamacare as best they can using the reconciliation process. They're using it because they can't get a bill through the Senate, which would require 60 votes to stop the debate, even if they have the majority.
Which is, as I recall, the way we got the ACA in the first place, but
No,
yes,
we didn't.
in the Senate,
No, that's not accurate. The ACA was passed by the Senate.
right, when it came back.
It didn't
After
come
Scott Brown.
It didn't come back. It passed the Senate, and the House passed an ACA version, and we would ordinarily have gone to conference and brought one version. And we sat in the Oval Office with the president, and we were quibbling, and we were only Democrats, because Republicans weren't working with us. And we were, well, this is not surprising. We even see Republicans disagreeing on their replacement. But we were trying to figure out how to reconcile the differences between the House version and the Senate version. At one point, the president said, "You have to stop fighting among yourselves because I might lose the 60th vote in the Senate in the special election that was going to be held the next week." And that's exactly what happened. So the only way we could pass the ACA at that point was for the House to take the Senate-passed bill and pass that bill. And then we tried to correct, as best we could, some of the problems in the Senate bill by using reconciliation.
Okay, fair enough. I didn't mean
was
to.
limited.
When we get back to Hatch-Waxman, we're there.
Hatch-Waxman.
You and Alcor have won this big
Hatch-Waxman.
victory.
We won this victory, and the bill was defeated. And in the next Congress, we said, let's look at the two issues, restoring the patent period, but also providing a pathway for generic competition. Now, the generic drugs had to go to FDA and go through the whole process of showing it, not that it's the same drug that's been on the market, but establishing the safety and efficacy of the generic, which may even raise, well, I think it raised ethical questions. They have to go through that whole process again, and it was redundant and unnecessary. So let's, we said, provide an abbreviated new drug application process for generics. And that was the basic framework of the Hatch-Waxman Act. I appreciate those who wanted to call it the Waxman-Hatch Act. My mother called it, may she rest in peace, the Waxman-Hatch Act. But she even called the bills I authored with Senator Kennedy the Waxman-Kennedy bills. Just don't call it Haxman-Watch or those other combination. Senator Hatch was the chairman of the what is now the Health Committee in the Senate, and I was chairman of the Subcommittee on Health and the Energy and Commerce Committee, and we worked out this framework. So we passed the legislation with the expectation we would have a balance. We would be able to have competition to lower prices and a greater incentive to develop new drugs. Also in the 80s, we adopted another bill to provide incentives for development of drugs for rare diseases, the Orphan Drug Act. And we looked at the problem as one where there were not sufficient incentives for the pharmaceutical companies to produce these orphan drug acts because the number of patients was so small, they didn't offer a big enough profit potential. So we worked on giving them the incentives to get as much profit as they could, get by being approved as an orphan drug, and those incentives were some tax breaks, but the big incentive was the 7 years exclusivity. We never envisioned that the Orphan Drug Act would provide a process for the manufacturers of these drugs to constantly evergreen their products, charge exorbitant prices when insurance companies particularly were willing to pay for the cost of the drug. And there has been a real problem in the Orphan Drug Act of very high prices for drugs that we thought were not going to be profitable. And in fact, they're extremely profitable.
What about if I had asked you in 1984, by 2017, how do you think we'll have 90% of the prescriptions generics? Would you have said, yeah, that's my plan, or never happen, or who the hell knows?
I would have said that I wouldn't know. I don't know what's going to happen within the next couple of years, let alone so many years down the road. The brand name companies and the generics were very separate organizations. And the brand name companies looked down their nose at the generics, even though the generic manufacturers produced a lot of the drugs that were being sold as brand name drugs. And today, if you would have asked me then, would I have envisioned that brand companies and generics would all be intertwined, where some of the same companies are producing both brand and generic, I would have doubted that because of the hostility between the two manufacturers.
What about the political climate on the Hill? Do you think that it's just over, and the idea that there could be a Democrat in the House and a Republican in the Senate doing a bill on some aspect of prescription drug prices, one of these proposals or one of the others are out there? Is that just impossible in the current climate?
Well, I've never operated on the basis of something's impossible. You just keep pushing the issues forward, and sometimes it takes time, and a lot of the legislation that I authored that became law took an enormous amount of time. The Ryan-White Act was an issue that when we first discovered AIDS without even knowing the word AIDS in 1981, and then we finally passed a bill, I think it was by 1990, or the regulation of tobacco, where in 1994 we had the tobacco executives tell us things that they knew weren't true, but it took us until 2009 to pass the legislation to regulate tobacco. So nothing to me is impossible. Nor do I think it's impossible in this year, because there's a public clamor about the high price of drugs. So my team, some of whom are here with me today, Bill Corr and Sophia Duong, Christy Martin's not here, and others that are working for Waxman Strategies, are working on a proposal funded by some foundations to try to present to the Congress a way to frame the issue that could lend it to a bipartisan support for not a magic bullet, because there is no magic bullet, but to look at the issue at what is driving the costs and how we might directly and indirectly impact the driving of those costs. And they're very different than the discussions you read about. There are many members who are very attracted to the idea of saying, let's import all these drugs because it's cheaper elsewhere. Well, that sounds good. It sounds easy, and people understand it. They go to Canada, they pay less for the drug. If they could import the drug from Canada at the price that they would pay in Canada and then pay the same price here, that solves our problem. What they miss, however, is that the drug manufacturers are not going to produce the amount of drugs for Canada that's going to also supply the market in the United States. And then, of course, it could look like it's coming from Canada, but it could have been made somewhere else. And it could be a counterfeit drug, and it's going to be an enormous burden on the FDA to decide whether it is a drug that we're going to allow to be sold in the United States, particularly on the safety side of it. So that's a magic bullet that everybody liked, but people forget we already adopted it. We already adopted a change in the law to allow importation of drugs with the qualification the FDA has to approve the safety and efficacy of these drugs that are being brought here. So people forget that, and they say, well, what we need to solve the problem is importation. Now, importation could solve some problems, and we heard about that earlier. If there's a shortage, if there's a lack of competition, but it can be established as a generic drug, both here in the United States and Europe, other places. But it's not the answer. A lot of people say what we need is the negotiation for Part D. Well, I think that's right. But it's hard to negotiate when somebody has a monopoly. And it's also hard to negotiate when you can't base a formulary on what is a better drug. We don't have some of the work that Steve Pearson's doing on ICER. We thought Corey might do that when we were adopting the ACA, but that got weakened very, very fast. So we need to find out the relative value of a new drug, and that could be the basis for formularies that could be based on a rational calculation. There are a lot of issues. We need to break them down, and we're coming up with a report probably in a matter of weeks, we hope, that the Commonwealth Foundation and the Arnold Foundation and all of us at Waxman Strategies are going to put out that will look at some of these issues. When I look at the Congress, not all the issues are in the same committee. The patent issues are the judiciary. A lot of the issues are in the health committees. So there are different committees that have different aspects of this, but if we can break it down and have Democrats and Republicans sit down, we're not going to give solutions, but we're going to say, these are the drivers. What are some of the ways we can deal with it? What do you want to work on? What can you pass for the near term? What can you pass for the longer period in the future to bring back the balance that we thought we achieved in the 1980s, to give the incentives, because we do need incentives for the investment of developing drugs, but also we need the competition.
Well, it's refreshing to have a former member of Congress answer a question that we might actually be able to get something done, which frankly, in my recent experience, is most former members of Congress throw up their hands and say, it's not like it used to be. So I appreciate the spirit with which you answer that question. But I want to go to the fast part. So do you think basically, as Louise and others have pointed out, there is a trade-off here? You want to give pharma an incentive to develop new and wonderful drugs that are curing diseases that our grandparents died from, but we don't want them to have too much more than necessary monopoly profits, and we don't want people to be unable to afford these men. So are you suggesting that we have the balance wrong, that over time we've gotten too much on the incentives and not enough on the other side?
Well, I think we've got the balance out of whack for a number of different reasons. We don't just have problems with the rollout of a new brand name drug. We have high-priced generic drugs if they're the sole source drug. What can we do to reinvigorate the generic side of things? We have anti-competitive behavior with the pay-for-play, where the brand company will say, we don't want a generic.
Pay for delay.
Pay for delay, right. Pay for play is the way Congress works. I take that back. You have that camera working.
I'm relieved that you have a little bit of cynicism left.
So there are issues that we need to approach what is the balance we want? What is the problem that's driving up the price? What can we deal with on a bipartisan basis? What can we get done? And I think it has to be bipartisan. It was bipartisan in the 80s. It was bipartisan when we added the Medicaid coverage of drugs, and it wasn't bipartisan on Medicare Part D, but it, well, I guess it was. It just wasn't that many Democrats. But we need to get some more rationality in the system.
And how would you evaluate the current state of the FDA? Are they doing a good job, bad job, could do better if they had more money, not aggressive enough?
Well, I think they could do more if they have more money, and I think they've been underfunded. I don't like the idea of the user fees, but we have to, even though I authored the original user fee, well, because I think it's a public function to approve drugs and for the FDA to decide safety and efficacy. And when you have the brand name companies, which was the original user fee, paying a fee to have their drugs evaluated, it doesn't sound great, but I think FDA has handled it well. One thing I don't want to see, and I don't think we will see, is that FDA should only go back and approve the safety and not the efficacy. And we have people expressing that point of view. I think President Trump expressed that point of view. But that's going to take a bill that's going to have 60 votes in the Senate. And I don't think a lot of people in the Trump administration would want to have the FDA do that job. But the FDA, and this is one of the concerns I had in the 21st Century Cures bill, must have the ability to follow the science. FDA decisions have to be based on science, not on politics. And I took issue when the FDA had the science to approve the day after drug for reproduction, but didn't, because even though they had the science, they didn't want to go forward with it because of the politics of it. FDA needs to be science-based and science-oriented in their decisions.
And what about the antitrust authorities? I mean, Fiona suggests basically they're not doing their job adequately. Do you agree with that?
I think there's a lot of anti-competitive behaviors. Whether it's antitrust that could solve the problem or not, it remains to be seen. We have the Federal Trade Commission look at the pay for delay, and they made a very strong recommendation not to allow it. It went all the way to the Supreme Court. And so now we have to look askance when you have a pay for delay, but why should we have a pay for delay? Who benefits? I know that the argument, both from the generic side and the brand name side, is you're avoiding litigation and it makes things easier, but it is clearly anti-competitive, and we need to eliminate some of the anti-competitive aspects in the law.
Your turn. Or I'll keep going.
Or I'll go home.
No, we don't want to do that. We don't want to do that. Really? Thank you. The mic is coming. Richard Frank.
Richard Frank. I'm going up to your last point on the antitrust, which is, even, and I think I agree that more could be done, antitrust is really cumbersome, right? It's rule of reason, it's very costly, it's very long. Aren't there sort of legislative things or regulatory actions that we could take that would at least take some of the burden off the antitrust authorities?
Well, I think that's a good question, and I want Democratic and Republican members of the Congress to look at that issue and come up with some ideas that they feel comfortable supporting on a bipartisan basis.
Fiona made a really good point that on one hand we want patients to have some skin in the game so they make good choices. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, we don't want to discourage them from taking medication. So do you think we've gone too far or not far enough in giving patients some share of the costs of prescription drugs?
Well, I don't know that it can be answered in a general statement because you have different situations with different drugs. But I think when we are trying to restore a balance, I think we have to keep in mind what is going to enable the patients to get the drugs they need. The coupons are a pretty clever way of keeping us paying for higher priced drugs than we need to. So I would like to have that sorted through. I don't think we have a lot of transparency in the way PBMs operate. I'd like to see more there. Those are my views, but we have to have sitting members think these issues through.
And how is this going to work? You think that if you go to Congress and say, okay, I've got money from these foundations, I've come up with a diagnosis of the problem, and it suggests that the shortcomings of Congress are they don't understand the problem. So if you present them with
that's a good starter.
The diagnosis that a spirit of bipartisanship will be rekindled on the Hill, and your heirs in Congress will realize that the voters are so angry about prescription drugs, and this might be one thing they could agree on, that they will bury that, take the knives out of each other's backs, and we'll actually get some legislation? Is that kind of the game plan?
Well, I don't think it's that. I think you sit down and say, what's driving up the price of drugs? Well, anti-competitive behavior is one of the drivers of costs. Orphan Drug Act is a driver of costs. Sole source drugs is a driver of costs. We have high launch prices, but then annual increases. Those are problems. What can we do about it? The biosimilars is a very big issue that breaks my heart because we had worked for a pathway for biosimilars, and the whole issue got hijacked with the ability to have an inordinate amount of time for protection against competition, and the evergreening problem that goes along with it. Well, is Congress happy with that? Is that a good way to have settled the issue? It isn't what President Obama had said he wanted. It's what the bio companies wanted, but then what can we do? Because that's driving up the cost, and the public does want incentives, but the benefit of competition. We're not getting the benefit of competition.
I just wanted to correct the impression that you might have given everyone by saying that I said the antitrust authorities were not doing their job.
Oh, sorry.
Okay, so I think they are doing their job, but I do think they could do more. And it is certainly a problem when we have legislation that, everybody's trying hard to make right, but then after the fact, firms figure out what little, loopholes in it that they can exploit. And that's, I think, when you can have a complementary effort of legislation and antitrust enforcement. You can, it's very clear the legislative history of Hatch-Waxman was not to allow pay for delay. And so then you can go in and that's part of the anti-competitive case. But Richard's right, it's slow. It's slow. And it would be nice to fix some of these problems quicker.
Peter? Fiona, could you just bring the mic over here? And there's a gentleman right behind.
I'm curious, of the proposals you heard today, what do you think are the least politically sellable and the most politically sellable? Yeah.
Well, I'm not going to guess. They're all very well thought out proposals. They're excellent recommendations. They ought to be considered. And I think that the authors of the papers thought through what might be practical under the circumstances. So let's let the policymakers think it through. But we're trying to frame the issues in this report to help members of Congress and the House and Senate to look at these issues anew. Like price information would be very helpful. What are you getting for paying more for the drug? What is it that would make this drug more valuable when it comes on the market than a drug that's already on the market? What added value? And even some of the pharmaceutical companies say this would help. It would help because we think that we get priced out by a drug that doesn't do as much as the drug we already have on the market. Somebody talked about insulin as maybe an example of that.
Steve?
Thank you for your comments. I had a question about the politics also of actually what I thought was emerging before the presidential election. As people talked about drug pricing, there was the concern about the prices, and then there was the concern and the effect, the costs on the health system, and then there was the part about out-of-pocket costs. And as you, I'm sure, remember, Secretary Clinton's campaign suggested that there would be caps on out-of-pocket costs and approaches to making sure that prices and costs for the whole health system were brought into a reasonable range. Going forward politically, do you see that kind of linkage of a law that would address out-of-pocket costs as well as the structural issues around pricing coming together, or would those be completely separate issues?
I think a cap on out-of-pocket costs would probably drive up insurance costs so that everybody would be sharing in those cost increases. But that doesn't necessarily produce a reduction in costs, in the prices rather, for the drugs, but it's one way of handling it. Look what we've done under Medicare Part D. We pushed people through the donut hole fast so that the government pays mostly for the reinsurance of the cost of the drug that people had to pay for more out of pocket in order to get through the donut hole. So that was not an ideal solution. We got to figure out not just to protect the person who's paying for the drug, but the system that's paying for the drug as well.
But he was asking basically to see some political appeal to the out-of-pocket cap as a way to get legislation through, even if you don't think it's a great idea.
Well, I think it certainly has its arguments, and a lot of people will find it very attractive to do
Rachel?
that.
So I'm curious about something you mentioned about the changing nature of the industry structure. So at the time of Hatch-Waxman, you said this is a compromise between two separate parts of the industry, the branded and the generic firms. But we've seen a lot of intermingling, and these days the biologics and the biosimilars are they're the same companies oftentimes. How do you see that affecting, if at all, prospects for other compromises going forward from the political economy perspective?
Well, I think we have to now ask, why aren't the generic companies producing more generics? And what would reinvigorate the competition from the generic companies? And I think that's a good question to ask and to try to figure out some answers to. I think that it's not just the brand companies. We think of the brand companies, they develop the new product, they have the patent, they have the monopoly. By the way, in the 1980s, we didn't have companies that had the monopoly because of a patent. Charge whatever the market would bear. In fact, many of those pharmaceutical company executives thought that that would be unseemly. Something has changed. It's not the law, but there's something's changed in our culture that says, you got the power to get every last cent out of this, just go for it. I don't know if that's a Wall Street issue, but it's nevertheless, I think, a factor in the high price of drugs.
Gentlemen, Anna, can you give the mic here? But let's, Scott, stand up so we can, no, right here.
Sure.
So we'll go to you next.
Okay. So my question is essentially, do you?
Who you are?
Hi, I'm Jonathan again. I was wondering if you view the BPCIA as a successful successor to the Hatch-Waxman Act in terms of like an act that was developed in the spirit, and if not, how can a more efficacious biologic/biosimilar pathway be developed? Is the burden on Congress or is it on the FDA?
Right, no acronyms here. So what the hell is BCPPA?
The Biologic Pricing and Innovation Act.
Oh, well, I think we needed to figure out a pathway. It's a little different for the bio products than it is for the small molecule products. They don't have to just show they're the same drug and they go right on the market through an abbreviated process. That's more complicated. And FDA, all of us wanted FDA to figure this out, and there's still more for FDA to do to get these drugs through. And the key will be the interchangeability of a new drug so that the price will actually come down. But even if you get another bio drug competing with an existing bio drug, that helps. But it's not the same as that they're interchangeable, and that's part of the pathway issue. But in that legislation, the Hatch-Waxman had 5 years of exclusivity. This law provided 12 years of exclusivity. Exclusivity is better than a patent because you can break a patent, but exclusivity means they cannot even consider another drug to compete. So that's just something to keep in mind, and it's one of the troubling aspects of it.
Patient gentleman here.
John Wilkerson. I'm a reporter at Inside Health Policy. I have a question about the Independent Payment Advisory Board. I won't get into the intricacies of how that works, but suffice it to say, the power of IPAB is expected to land in the lap of the Trump administration this year. If that happens, do you see this as spurring action on drug prices either in Congress or within the administration? Is this a good opportunity to do something?
Well, IPAB was one of the ways to hold down costs of health care. And the President Obama wanted every possible way to hold down health care costs because he said we're going to expand health care for those who didn't have the ability to buy insurance in the individual market. We wanted to make changes in the overall system that would hold down costs. And when Medicare acts to hold down costs, it becomes very effective in the private insurance market as well. But it's controversial, and I know that's going to be a point of contention. It provides the ability to come in with a proposal of how to hold down some costs in Medicare that could be picked up elsewhere. But the most controversial part of it is that Congress can be read out of it if they can't come up with an alternative to the proposal from IPAB and, more importantly, the proposal from the administration, because you don't even have to have IPAB. It's never probably going to be established the way it looks now. But the secretary can come in and say, this is what I think could hold down costs, and let's go after pharmaceutical prices. Well, that's pretty bold, and then to have it go into effect without Congress approving it ruffles the feathers of a
Wouldn't
lot
they
of
have to
congressmen.
appoint people to IPAD before it could actually, they don't?
No.
No.
IPAD was to recommend to the secretary some ideas
Oh.
that the secretary could propose that would go into effect unless Congress came up with something that achieved the equivalent reductions.
Interesting. There's a lot of power to Tom Price. I want to thank everybody for coming today, and particularly to our panelists, to our colleagues, Terry Granis and Peter Olson, and others who helped us, and Lilia Chirchari. One favor, as you leave, if you take the papers and coffee cups that are at your feet and put them in the trash pile in the end, our staff would appreciate it. Again, thanks to everybody for coming.